In the drowned river valleys of southern Louisiana, where tree limbs crack like bones in the mist, and every fence post leans inward as if whispering secrets to the mud, there exists a documented case that has defied explanation since the mid-19th century. In 1852, Eliza Renshaw buried her husband for the 7th and final time. Not 7 husbands, 1 husband, 7 burials, each in a different cemetery, each preceded by a death certificate signed by the same doctor, each followed by a wake attended by increasingly fewer neighbors, and each exhumed weeks later, always under strange circumstances, flooding, shifting ground, local suspicion, and every time the coffin yielded something new, something not him, something of her. The case appears in fragments across 3 parish registries, a coroner's book missing its middle pages, and a solitary journal kept by an apprentice gravedigger named Declan Weems, who vanished after the 7th interment and was never seen again. Weems wrote of seeing things no one believed: footprints circling the fresh graves before dawn, bone-white fingers wrapped around coffin hinges, and once, a shadow inside the earth that moved against the grain of gravity. But the strangest detail, what has puzzled historians, folklorists, and theologians alike, is that each time the grave was opened, a piece of Eliza was found inside. Not her body, not her breath, but her name, her signature, her past. A wedding veil tucked in the folds of the burial shroud, a lock of red blonde hair woven into the lining of the jacket, a birth certificate stamped Eliza Ann Whitmore, 1823. In one instance, a parish priest reported finding her portrait, aged and cracked but unmistakable, pressed flat against the chest of the corpse that wasn't her husband, because it was never her husband, not once. And yet, the papers remained unchanged. Cause of death, fever. Identity, Edgar Renshaw, buried by Eliza Renshaw, widow. The official story has never wavered, but the graves tell another. This channel isn't for everyone, only for those who are willing to sit with stories that don't fit inside the walls of reason. Before we descend into Willow Parish and its silent graveyards, make sure you're subscribed, because the ground we're walking into remembers more than it reveals. And let us know in the comments, what state are you listening from? Because what happened in Louisiana might not be as far from your hometown as you'd like to believe. This story doesn't begin with madness or murder or curses. It begins with something older. A woman who loved her husband so fiercely that death did not feel like the end. The Willow Parish of 1852 was a place clinging to the edges of civilization, where Catholic and Protestant settlements converged around swamplands and trading posts, where Creole and English names mingled in church registries, and where cemeteries were often built before the churches themselves. The Renshaws were not wealthy, but respected. Edgar ran a supply ferry along the Atchafalaya, and Eliza was known for tending the sick with remedies learned from her mother, who in turn had learned from an old midwife with one eye and no tongue. They were married young, lost 3 children in infancy, and buried Eliza's brother during the yellow fever epidemic of 1847. People said they were marked by grief, but steady in it, until Edgar died, or so the record said. Fever, September 13th, 1849, buried 2 days later in Hollow Creek Cemetery, plot 19A. No photograph exists of the original grave, but the groundskeeper, at the time, an Irish immigrant named Darby Collins, scribbled something odd in the logbook. Lady wouldn't leave till moonset, laid a locket inside his sleeve, laughed like a child when she walked away. That grave flooded 10 days later. Locals said the water rose in minutes, though no rain had fallen. When the casket was retrieved, it was dry, untouched. Inside lay a single sheet of music, the Willow Waltz, a tune Eliza used to hum while mending Edgar's shirts. No body, no bones, just the melody, handwritten in her looping cursive, and a bouquet of 7 white lilies, still fragrant. The cemetery officials called it vandalism. The parish doctor reissued the death certificate, and Edgar was buried again, this time in St. Adelard's, a Catholic plot despite their Protestant faith. Eliza paid extra to have the grave blessed. She stood alone at the service, veil pressed against her mouth, and did not speak. When that grave was disturbed by a caved-in sycamore months later, it yielded a child's bonnet, labeled E. Whitmore, age 3, and a sealed envelope that read in delicate ink, "For the 7th." That was only the second burial. There were 5 more, and each one stranger than the last. The third burial took place on a windless morning in April of 1850 in the red clay backlot of Cypress Bend, a private burial field used by a dwindling congregation of primitive Baptists whose chapel had burned down a decade earlier. No hymns were sung, no bell was rung, and no preacher presided. Eliza arrived with 2 men from town who said nothing and dug quickly, as if eager to be gone. The coffin, cedar, unmarked, was lowered before sunrise, and by the time townsfolk passed the bend on their way to market, the only sign of activity was a thin line of disturbed soil and 3 boot prints facing east. That grave lasted 6 days. On the 7th, a group of children playing along the riverbank reported a woman's voice humming from the ground. When their father came to investigate, he claimed the earth around the grave was warm to the touch and pulsing faintly. He brought the sheriff. The sheriff brought a shovel. When they lifted the coffin lid, they found a woman's dress, folded neatly. It matched the one Eliza had worn to Edgar's first funeral. Beneath it was a lock of her hair, tied with the same ribbon used in her wedding bouquet. No man, no bones, just fabric, scent, and strands of her history braided tight. Sheriff Latham made notes in his ledger that day, notes later retrieved by a historian in 1919. Something's wrong. Not criminal, not sane either. Lady keeps burying her husband, but no husband to be found. They called it hysteria, the polite word for madness among women of station. But Eliza was not dismissed. She was not restrained. She was left alone, allowed to grieve, allowed to return for the 4th. That one was buried in the Renshaw family plot near Lake Isabel, under an old cypress marked with the initials ER carved by a boy's pocket knife 20 years prior. The grave was filled with stones, not soil, Eliza insisted. She said soil shifted, stones stayed. The coffin was heavier this time. The undertaker swore it took 3 men to lift. But when that grave was opened 6 weeks later, this time by parish order, citing concerns of improper burial, the stones were still there, but the coffin inside was filled with water, perfectly clear, not a speck of mud. Floating atop it, a lace handkerchief with the initials EAW, Eliza Ann Whitmore, and a letter addressed "To whom it may concern," but inside was blank. Just pages and pages of parchment, untouched by ink or time. A doctor was called. A priest consulted. Neither had answers. That same night, thunder struck a chapel 3 miles north, burning it to its foundation. Eliza did not attend the inquest. She was already preparing for burial number 5. This one took place in complete secrecy, without permit, on private farmland owned by a Mr. Lawton, a recent widower whose wife had died screaming of birds she claimed were hiding inside the walls. Lawton told no one. He allowed Eliza the space behind the old barn. She paid in silver. That grave, too, would be discovered months later when Lawton's cattle refused to walk the eastern fence line. The unearthed box contained a porcelain doll with Eliza's wedding ring fastened to its wrist by red twine. The doll's eyes were missing. In their place, 2 beetles, still alive. The 6th burial was never recorded in any official log, only found referenced in the private letters of a Sister Miriam, a Catholic nun who had been stationed at the mission infirmary in Willow Parish during the winter of 1851. She wrote, "The widow came again today, pale, shaking, asked if the chapel still had a reliquary. I said no, it was removed after the storm. She wept like her body was breaking, asked for a place in the garden. I gave her the earth near the rosemary. She buried a man, she said, but the man was not her husband, and the soil would tell the truth. I did not ask more. That soil would later be dug up by a groundskeeper looking for a burst pipe. The coffin had collapsed inward. Nothing remained but pages, hundreds of them, pages of Eliza's childhood diary, wrapped in cloth, stitched with hair. The seventh and final burial occurred under stormlight in a makeshift graveyard on the edge of Red Hollow, where the trees grow inward and no birds sing. Witnesses say the wind stopped when the coffin touched the ground. They say Eliza stood perfectly still for 2 hours. They say she kissed the dirt. That grave has never been opened, but people who pass it say they hear music. The Willow Waltz, played slow, on a violin made of bone. By the summer of 1853, the name Eliza Renshaw had become a sort of hush in Willow Parish, a name spoken only in the pauses between conversation, only in rooms where candles flickered for no reason, and corners stayed dark too long. The official record, sparse and uncertain, lists her as widow, seamstress of Whitmore descent, though no documentation of her parentage could be verified after the courthouse fire of '39. Townsfolk remembered her as quiet, respectable, always dressed in black even before Edgar's supposed death. But something changed after the seventh burial. She stopped attending church, stopped opening her shop window, stopped replying to notes. Her house remained intact. Neat lace curtains, a rose bush trimmed sharp, front steps swept every morning, but no one saw her pass through its door. Yet the chimney smoked, and every evening, without fail, one lantern glowed from the upper bedroom. The sheriff made 2 attempts to speak with her. The first time, he left a card beneath the door. The second, he knocked until his knuckles bruised. No reply, no noise. But when he turned to leave, he found his own card placed atop the garden gate, folded once and tucked inside, a single red thread. That fall, children dared each other to run up to her porch and touch the door. One girl claimed the doorknob burned like iron from a forge. Another said the windows didn't reflect your face, only showed the inside of a room filled with water, floating pages, and a dress pinned to the ceiling. But no one believed her, not until the leaves fell, and the mailman reported that Eliza's letters had started arriving again. Dozens of them, each addressed to the same name, Eliza May Whitmore, herself. Each envelope sealed with black wax and a thumbprint too small to be hers. One letter was opened by mistake, having no postage and no address other than whomever walks by. Inside, a sketch of a cradle. The name Edgar written once, then crossed out, then written again, then crossed out again. Over and over. The local pastor, Reverend Fields, was summoned for counsel but declined. He had performed Edgar's first burial and had witnessed the 4th exhumation himself. Since then, he'd begun suffering from night sweats and episodes of missing time, and refused to pass by the Renshaw house even during daylight. He did, however, grant the historian Elizabeth Mary access to the church archives, under the condition that she never speak the Renshaw name aloud in his presence. Mary, whose 1903 research would become the backbone of all future inquiry into the Willow Parish case, documented 7 graves, 6 exhumations, 3 affidavits, and 1 anonymous diary entry signed only E. Her notes describe inconsistencies not only in the coffin contents but in the death records themselves. Edgar Renshaw was listed as deceased in February 1849, cause fever. Yet another record, found wedged inside a hymnal from the choir loft, listed him as dying in 1851 by drowning. No coroner's name, no witnesses, just a scrawled date and a line. He knew too much about the first. Mari theorized that Edgar's body may never have existed at all, that he was, in essence, a figment anchored by public ritual, but never private truth. But this doesn't explain the headstones, the caskets, the witnesses, or the entries in Eliza's own accounting ledger, which, recovered decades later, contained lines like, April 12th, paid in bone, heaviest box yet, and June 1st, head faced west this time. Will it stay? The ledger ends abruptly after this final note. August 3rd, his face was mine. The next page is blank. Every page after that soaked in water damage that no restoration method could fix. Those pages reeked of lavender and blood. The house itself stood at the edge of town like a story people avoided telling, its whitewashed wood now the color of old parchment, and its shutters hanging crooked as if it too were mourning something that never stayed buried. The locals stopped calling it the Renshaw house. They simply called it her place. It was the kind of house children crossed the street to avoid and postmen delivered mail to with averted eyes. Yet nothing about it was outwardly sinister. The yard was kept, the gate never creaked, and the porch steps held no rot. But people swore strange things about the air around it, that it carried a hum, like distant cello strings played from under floorboards, that the roses never bloomed but never died either, that the shadows beneath the oak tree out front didn't follow the sun's position. Inside, as later photographs would confirm during the Mari investigation, every mirror had been removed or covered with veils of black muslin, and in the uppermost room, nailed behind a false panel in the wall, investigators found a collection of burial notices, each for Edgar Renshaw, all written in different hands, all dated differently, all signed by E. Whitmore. The same signature also appeared in a stitched embroidery frame hanging in the kitchen. To the one I keep burying, may you stay this time. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came from a diary page pressed between two panes of glass hidden in the bedroom headboard. The ink was dry, the parchment cracked, but the words were clearly legible. It read, "The 7th is the true one, not because of what it holds, but because it no longer returns. But I feel him still, not walking, not speaking, only remembering, and he remembers everything, especially me." This is where Mary's investigation took its darkest turn, because, while she'd already documented the strange contents of the exhumed coffins and Eliza's apparent disintegration into reclusion, she could not explain the sightings that began in 1854, nearly 2 years after the 7th and final burial. Townsfolk, those who dared pass through the southern trails at dusk, claimed to see a figure dressed in mourning black walking alone, sometimes barefoot, sometimes with mud smeared across her chest, as if she had clawed her way out of something. These sightings would not be remarkable on their own. Grief manifests strangely, but what chilled even skeptics was that Eliza herself had not been seen for months. Her house remained closed, chimney cold, the lantern no longer burning. Sheriff Latham eventually forced entry and found the house empty, furniture intact, a pot of untouched tea on the stove, cooled but not moldy, suggesting she'd left recently. On the table sat a single object, a child's cradle, not dusted, not old, freshly painted in white with rose-colored trim. The cradle was sealed shut with wax, and carved into the headboard were the words, "For the 8th." That detail raised the question no one wanted to ask. Had Eliza ever been burying Edgar at all? Or had each coffin been an attempt to trap something else? Something older? Something that wore Edgar's name the way a mask wears a face? The locals had no appetite for further questions. Within a year, her house was boarded up and eventually purchased by a couple from Mississippi who stayed one night before fleeing, reportedly due to a cradle that wouldn't stop rocking. They left all possessions behind. The cradle, it said, was later buried behind the house in a box of salt and iron. That spot is now overgrown. Nothing grows around it, not even weeds. Eliza Renshaw was never officially declared dead. Her death certificate reads only, "Fate unknown," but every few years, someone claims to see her on the road that skirts the edge of Willow Parish, wearing black, hands covered in soil, humming a tune only she seems to know. By the spring of 1855, Willow Parish's collective memory had been reduced to a series of muttered phrases, superstitious gestures, and a shared agreement not to speak the Renshaw name in churches or taverns, as if repeating it aloud might summon the echo of something best left unsaid. The house stood silent. The cradle mound in the backyard, still encircled by a bent iron fence twisted into a crude pentagram, had become a place schoolchildren ran past without looking, convinced that to glance at it was to risk being seen in return. The land around the cradle had changed. Roots no longer grew in straight lines. Birds avoided the oak's branches. And one hunter claimed the moss beneath the tree pulsed like breath when stepped on. Then came the census of that year, part of a federal expansion project aimed at documenting the outlier towns of southern Louisiana. And with it came a young clerk named Jonas Fielding, age 24, assigned to Willow Parish. He was meticulous, idealistic, and unfamiliar with the rumors. He filed records from dry ledgers and ignored verbal warnings from the town's elderly, dismissing their hesitations as backwoods folklore. When he arrived at the Renshaw property, he noted the unpainted shutters and the absence of curtains, but not the oppressive stillness that hung in the air. His notes, later recovered from his saddlebag found discarded beside a tree near the road, state, "No sign of occupant, door unlocked, property intact, no evidence of theft or squatting. Upstairs cradle shows signs of recent use, contains locket with hair, blonde, and folded church bulletin from 1849 with Renshaw marriage announcement. Strange. Bulletin is dated one day after recorded wedding. Ink still wet." Fielding's disappearance was noted a week later, when the local postmaster found his horse wandering the edge of a sugarcane field, foam on its lips and its hooves covered in salt, as if it had crossed something brined and burning. No body was recovered, but days later his shoes were found placed neatly on the chapel's front steps, beside a tin of black wax and an envelope addressed to the archivist. The letter inside said only, "She told me where the others went, but they're not there anymore." This triggered a final inquiry into the Renshaw file, this time not from the state, but from the Society of Historical Occurrences, a private organization known for investigating events deemed incompatible with linear documentation. Their lead researcher, Dr. Rosalind Harrow, spent 3 weeks in Willow Parish, comparing maps, church records, and eyewitness reports. Her conclusion, while never officially published, survives in a collection of private correspondences. Each burial coincided with an atmospheric anomaly: barometric dips, electrical storms, blood tide and river crawfish. The 7th event broke the cycle. The 8th was never meant to happen. And now time, as it applies to that land, has become unstable. What did she mean by unstable? Locals had already begun reporting unusual phenomena: timepieces that ran backward near the Renshaw boundary, voices repeating spoken phrases seconds after they were said, and most disturbingly, dreams that crossed from person to person like shared memories. One family, descendants of the Whitmores, abandoned their farm after all 5 members began drawing the same image each morning upon waking: a figure in black kneeling beside a sealed cradle, writing names into the dirt. The figure always wore Eliza's locket, and always, beside her, stood a man, sometimes faceless, sometimes grinning, sometimes holding a shovel in one hand and a birth certificate in the other. What connects these reports, these resurgences, These shadowy loops in Willow Parish's past is the idea that something never stayed buried. Not a body, not a secret, but a promise that Eliza's repeated burials were not acts of mourning, but acts of containment. That each grave was an attempt not to remember Edgar, but to forget something he had learned, something that bore her name, her hair, her dates. 7 graves, 7 attempts, each one failed. The 8th wasn't supposed to be a burial at all. It was meant to be a trap, but instead, it became a door. By the time autumn arrived in 1856, the name Renshaw had vanished from tax rolls, land ledgers, and even tombstone inscriptions, as if something or someone had gone through the bureaucratic entrails of Willow Parish and excised it entirely, thread by delicate thread. Yet the land remembered. You could feel it in the way the trees bowed at unnatural angles near the southern bend of Parish Road 9, as though leaning to hear something underground. Travelers spoke of finding things they hadn't brought: a child's shoe on the front seat of a locked carriage, a strip of black lace tied to a lantern pole, a page from an unbound hymnal stuck to the side of a well. The same hymnal page, verified by Pastor Lemuel Carey of St. Matthew's Chapel, appeared 3 times in 1 week, always verse 7, "And she shall rise, though clothed in grief, for he who knew her name will speak it not." By then, speculation had shifted from Eliza's madness to Edgar's origin. One theory, drawn from a letter found in the diary of Margaret Dinch, a midwife who attended Edgar's mother, suggested that Edgar had not been born, but found, wrapped in thistle branches on the steps of a burned courthouse the night after a meteor storm. No one could verify that courthouse ever existed, but the story persisted, passed along in hushes like someone handing off a burning match. People claimed Edgar never cast a reflection, that livestock trembled when he passed, that on his wedding day the river behind the chapel ran red, not blood, but a thick iron color that turned the lilies to ash. These details were never documented officially, but they haunted the oral record of Willow Parish the way a wrong note haunts a hymn. The archivists who visited in 1871 under the pretense of mapping local genealogies noted something else: that every woman who lived within 1 mile of the Renshaw house between 1849 and 1852 miscarried. The official cause was listed as nutritional deficiency, but one of the archivists, Jonathan Wexley, kept private notes. One entry, now stored at Tulane's Special Collections Archive, reads, "All stillbirths had names. Names they should not have known. One grave marked Nathaniel Whitmore Renshaw. Though the Whitmores deny ever using that name, the handwriting matches Eliza's birth certificate signature." He ended that page with a question in red ink: did she lose a child or leave one? That same year, the sealed cradle, once buried behind the house, was reportedly unearthed by a pair of railroad workers laying survey lines for a proposed track that was never completed. One of them, Elijah Boone, claimed the cradle wasn't empty, but contained a wax effigy of a man with no face. When they returned the next morning with tools and a local constable, the cradle was gone, but a depression in the soil remained, along with a faint scent of lavender and ash. Boone's companion left town that week. Elijah himself was found years later, muttering verses no one recognized and carving doll cradles from pine with his fingernails until his fingers bled. His final words, recorded by the Sisters of Mercy Hospital in Shreveport, were, "Don't let her sing it again. The lullaby makes the ground listen." What did he mean by the ground listening? And more pressingly, what lullaby? In 1883, a wax cylinder was discovered in the ruins of the Willow Parish schoolhouse during post-flood cleanup. Though badly damaged, when played through a restored phonograph, it produced a distorted melody, Ethnomusicologists later determined it matched no known regional hymns, lullabies, or folk songs, but one note, a low, quivering F-sharp, matched the same tone reportedly hummed by Eliza during her husband's second burial, recorded in a forgotten corner of a preacher's journal with the line, "She sang to the grave like she expected it to answer." And maybe it did, because from that moment on, none of the graves ever stayed the same. By the turn of 1890, Willow Parish had become a cartographic anomaly, a place that existed on no modern map yet was still referenced in footnotes, shipping logs, and the margins of family Bibles worn thin by generations too scared to tear out the past. Riverboat captains navigating the Atchafalaya swore the fog thickened when their vessels neared the parish line, as if the land itself inhaled deeply when watched. Surveyors who attempted to chart the region returned with notes so inconsistent, compasses spinning on dry earth, shadows cast in opposite directions at noon, that the state quietly classified it as a spiritual hazard zone, a term used internally to refer to locations where folklore and physical reality refused to agree. The Renshaw property, now more ruin than house, was said to still have warm spots on its floors in winter and cold breath on the back of your neck in July. Yet, the story that reignited national curiosity wasn't a ghost sighting or even another burial. It was a letter. In 1891, the New Orleans Gazette published a small notice in their Curios and Correspondence section, an anonymous envelope sent from Shreveport. Inside, a photo of a sealed pine cradle set in the center of an abandoned chapel, wax dripping from its corners, and a single name scratched into the cradle's headboard: Eliza Abigail Renshaw, 1823-2. No death date, no engraving for Edgar, just her name. On the back of the photograph, written in faded brown ink, "I buried him again, and he came back, but this time he brought my name with him." The handwriting matched historical samples of Eliza's letters, but the photograph had a problem. The chapel in the photo no longer existed. St. Lament's Chapel, once the spiritual hub of Willow Parish, had been razed in 1868 after a fire consumed the steeple, blackened the pews, and left what the surviving priest called a smell like iron and honey that clung to your lungs for days. The flames had spared only the altar, which locals interpreted as divine mercy, until someone lifted the altar stone and found beneath it a page from Eliza's wedding vows, folded into the shape of a cradle and tied with black lace. No one knew how it got there. The church had burned 17 years after her last documented burial of Edgar, and yet here it was, her signature, her handwriting, on a vow never publicly recorded and buried in a chapel that had not existed for over 2 decades when the photo surfaced. It didn't make sense, but nothing about the Renshaws ever had. What followed was a brief but feverish national obsession. Spiritualists descended on the parish, claiming they could feel the rip in time where the cradle had once rested. Mediums held seances inside the ruined chapel foundations, speaking in voices they claimed belonged to Eliza, or worse, Edgar himself. One woman, a self-proclaimed vessel named Maudine Odell, delivered a line while in trance that froze every reporter in the room. "He comes back every 7th year, wearing my name like skin, asking where I buried the truth." The room grew silent. A photographer from Boston fainted. A Confederate veteran who had wandered into the session for warmth dropped his whiskey bottle and began reciting Psalm 91 in reverse. When Maudine woke, she had no memory of the words, but her palms bore fresh calluses, the kind you'd get from lowering 7 pine caskets into the ground by rope. Still, it was a regional historian named Reverend Claude Beale who uncovered what may have been the final key to the mystery. While cataloging neglected parish records in a Lafayette attic, he found a page torn from a handwritten ledger titled simply "The Marriages of Willow Parish." It listed 12 marriages in the span of 3 years, normal for the time. But beside one entry, the ink had been violently smeared. Eliza Abigail Renshaw to Edgar T., and then nothing. No surname, no officiant, no witnesses, just a jagged black line, as if someone had tried to strike out the past with ink. But, under candlelight and chemical treatment, Reverend Beale found faint traces of a second name beneath the smear. Not Edgar, not even a man's name, but a woman's, Cecilia Renshaw, her sister. The same sister Eliza claimed had died of fever at age 10. The same sister whose birth certificate had never been found. The same name carved into the underside of the 7th coffin, according to a carpenter who refused to ever build another. But this revelation, Eliza marrying someone named after her dead sister, or worse, someone posing as her, raised a deeper question. Who had Eliza really been burying all those years? And what, if anything, had she unearthed instead? Because somewhere between the 6th and 7th burials something shifted. The graves no longer filled with soil, but with water. Not rainwater, not groundwater, brackish, stagnant water that smelled of rust and whispered when disturbed. In 1892, a child named Emil Roth fell into the 7th grave site while chasing a butterfly. He was found 20 minutes later, alive but shaken, holding a silver ring in his hand and repeating a single phrase, "She didn't die. She folded." When asked what that meant, he replied, "Like paper, like how you fold something to make it smaller." Then he wept and refused to speak again, and for the rest of his life, he would write only with folded paper, never flat sheets. Every letter, every word, creased and bent, as though language itself could be haunted if left too open. By 1900, the parish elders began placing warnings at the Renshaw boundary, rusted signs that read, "Fold nothing here, it returns." The phrase confused outsiders, but locals understood. Folding meant opening, and opening meant returning, and no one wanted what the cradle might bring back again. Because if the 7th burial had failed, and it had, then something still waited below. Not a man, not a memory, but a name that was no longer Eliza's alone. A name now worn by something else, something buried and watching. There's something peculiar about the way maps from the 19th century depict Willow Parish. They don't, not in any official sense. Instead, the region's outline is often distorted, as though cartographers had grown hesitant when their pencils reached that part of Louisiana, their lines stuttering or fading altogether. A gap, a suggestion of land that didn't want to be known. But among river traders and long-haul mail riders, the place had a reputation older than any parchment. The parish where the dead stay restless. That phrase was carved into the underside of a pew in a traveling church that passed through the region in 1873. The same phrase was whispered by the last surviving child of the Thibodeau family, Ameline, who, in her final moments in 1921, screamed from her deathbed that Eliza's name is wrong now. It has corners. What that meant, no one understood. But it made the rounds, like everything in Willow Parish did, through rumor first and record second, and always circling back to the Renshaw cradle, because by the end of the 19th century, it was no longer buried. It was seen, physically seen. 3 separate sightings were logged in the town clerk's incident reports between 1895 and 1898. Each from different locations, and each describing the exact same impossible object, a sealed pine cradle, gently rocking by itself in places it shouldn't be, on top of a dried-up well in Cane Hollow, beneath the eaves of a collapsed barn near Widow's Hill, and once, most chillingly, inside the sanctuary of the new church, built on top of the ruins of St. Lament's, That last sighting was witnessed by the entire congregation during an Easter sunrise service. No one spoke, no one moved. The cradle remained for 6 full minutes, casting no shadow, swaying gently despite the absence of wind. Then it was simply gone. The pastor who had conducted the service never spoke again, except to scratch out the phrase, "Not her, never her," just what wore her name, into his pulpit before resigning and disappearing into the swamps. Investigators dispatched from Baton Rouge found no signs of tampering, no pranksters, no hidden mechanisms, but they did find something else. Beneath the church's altar, once again, directly below where the Renshaw marriage vow had previously been discovered, they unearthed a buried box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were 7 items: a silver comb with a tooth snapped in half, a pair of gloves embroidered with the initials E.R., a letter addressed to "My dearest husband," a child's tooth, a broken chain from a pocket watch, a pressed daffodil, and a page torn from a family Bible, listing Eliza Renshaw as wife, but with no husband recorded. 7 items, 7 burials, 7 desecrations, but none explained the new theory that emerged in academic circles in the early 1900s, that Eliza's repeated reburials had not been mistakes, nor madness, nor superstition, but ritual, intentional, patterned, deliberate. A doctoral thesis submitted in 1902 by Mabel Elkins at Tulane University posed the chilling idea that each of the 7 burials had been staged by Eliza to separate herself from something she had once bound to Edgar, not to bury her husband, but to bury the parts of her that remained in him. Each grave was a shedding, a name, a memory, a vow, a physical trace. Her hair, her lace, her signature, transferred into the earth, into him, and locked away again and again. But what happened when the final trace was buried? Who or what remained? For Willow Parish, the question stopped being hypothetical in 1905, when local schoolteacher Adeline Marrow was found inside the Renshaw family crypt, alive but disoriented, speaking in an accent that hadn't been heard in the region since before the Civil War. She had no memory of entering the crypt. She had been walking to Sunday service when she claimed the trees folded inward, and the wind whispered a woman's name she couldn't remember, but her mouth kept saying it anyway. Eliza, Eliza, Eliza. She was found sitting upright in the broken cradle, eyes wide, hands folded neatly in her lap, humming a lullaby no one recognized. But when played on piano, the melody matched the rhythm of a prayer found in Eliza's 1848 diary. An entry written in reverse, meant never to be read aloud, yet the tune had somehow survived. Waiting in the air, waiting for someone to sit in that cradle again. After the incident, Adeline never returned to teaching. She became mute, but not from trauma. She reportedly began writing messages in loops, not sentences, circles, entire pages filled with concentric loops of text, each loop repeating the phrase, "I only wanted him to stay buried." The paper she used yellowed overnight. The ink bled upwards, and when one page was burned, the ashes refused to scatter. They clumped, solidified, and inside, the ash clump was a small charred ring, a wedding ring, but no one in the parish could identify the initials engraved within. CR, not ER, not Edgar, and certainly not Eliza, unless her name had never been Eliza to begin with. This cast doubt on the original records. Were the parish logs wrong? Was Eliza a name taken or given to mask something else entirely? The oldest surviving midwife in the parish, Eveline Chastain, who had delivered Eliza's supposed stillborn son in 1847, confessed in her final moments that the child had not been stillborn. He had screamed once and then gone silent, not because he had died, but because Eliza had shushed him and the child obeyed. Like he already knew her, Eveline whispered, not as his mother, as something older. When pressed, she wept and added, that boy wasn't hers. She was his. From that moment on, a new theory emerged. Not that Eliza had buried her husband repeatedly, but that she had buried the child. Or rather, the child buried himself using her as a vessel, a child that grew backwards, that folded its own story through hers, that wore her name, her marriage, her face, and that, maybe, had never left Willow Parish. Because if the cradle remained, and the sightings continued, and the names kept changing, then what they had buried wasn't a man, or even a woman, but a loop, a fold, a name that could never stay dead because it had never truly lived. And that name, no matter how many times it was buried, always carried Eliza with it, piece by piece, signature by signature, vow by vow. Until now it had become something else entirely, something watching, something rocking gently in the dark, and always asking, which name shall I wear next? By 1910, the name Renshaw had all but vanished from Willow Parish, not because it had been forgotten, but because it had been removed. Entire ledgers had their pages torn out. Census forms showed gaps in the family line. Marriage certificates listing Eliza's maiden name were scorched at the corners or smeared with ink. In the courthouse basement, a single document labeled Renshaw, expungement order, bore no date, no issuing clerk, and no seal. Only a line drawn diagonally across the parchment, etched so deeply that it cut through the wood of the filing drawer beneath. And yet, the house remained. The Renshaw homestead, a two-story clapboard structure with ivy-choked windows and a widow's walk that faced no body of water, continued to exist in the woods north of Cane Hollow. It should have collapsed decades earlier. No one maintained it. No one claimed ownership. But the building stood, not just as a ruin, but as a structure seemingly immune to decay. Shingles, though warped, never fell. Nails, though rusted, still held fast. Insects avoided the frame. Moss crept up the exterior but never crossed the door frame. Locals avoided the path leading to it, not out of fear, but out of instinct. A generation raised on whispers had learned that the land itself did not welcome visitors. Those who tried reported hallucinations of rain when the sky was clear, or the distinct feeling of being watched by something that stood just out of frame. Cameras brought to document the building refused to function. Even pencil sketches warped into spirals. But it was the inside of the house that finally drew researchers back in 1911, when the body of historian Aldrich Hewson was discovered seated in the second-floor nursery, cradling a bundle of rags he had swaddled into the Renshaw cradle. The note beside him was short. It wasn't her, but she wore her teeth. The bundle contained no bones, no flesh, no doll. Just Eliza Renshaw's final will, copied by hand in Hewson's own handwriting despite having never seen the original. The handwriting analysis was confirmed by 3 separate examiners. The ink used was traced to a formula popular in 1851 and long discontinued, and the paper was the same grain and mill brand used in St. Lament's record books, which had burned to ash nearly half a century earlier. How Hewson came into possession of either material remained unexplained. The will itself was addressed not to a person, but to a direction. To the one who followed me west. It made no mention of Edgar. Instead, it cataloged a series of items to be placed in various places across the state, under stones, within wells, sewn into clothing left at abandoned churches. All marked only with a name, Clara Ruthven. That name had never appeared in the Renshaw line before, but a grave bearing it, Clara Ruthven, 1821 to 1852, was discovered in the northernmost cemetery of the parish, behind the ruins of a burnt chapel once known as St. Augustine's. It had no known records. The chapel had burned in 1862, allegedly struck by lightning. But when the grave was exhumed, what lay inside had no name, no form, just layers of fabric stitched entirely from human hair, not sewn but woven, with every strand tagged by a single monogrammed bead. ER every strand, thousands of them. As if someone had spent decades separating and labeling each hair Eliza Renshaw had ever shed. It was a textile of identity, woven into a cocoon or perhaps a shroud for something that had no body, only memory. This discovery triggered a new wave of speculation. Had Eliza buried Edgar 7 times to sever her own bindings to the name Ruthven? Had she attempted, through ritual or madness, to disentangle herself from something that called itself her husband, but had never been human? Because the Ruthven name did not appear in Louisiana records, but it did appear in a single travel ledger from Massachusetts, dated 1817, listing a Clara Ruthven as a traveling nurse who had reportedly treated over 24 children in a fever ward. The notes on her file indicated something unusual. Patient recovery noted to coincide with sudden deaths of parent caretakers. No criminal investigation had followed, but the record ended with a final line: transferred to private estate in Willow Parish, Louisiana. Purpose: maternity care. No follow-up logs exist, but the year matches the birth of Edgar Renshaw, meaning Clara Ruthven didn't just arrive in the parish, she may have delivered Eliza's future husband, or worse, became him, not biologically, but through some transfer of essence, of spirit, of name, as if her life had folded itself into his, only to be later mirrored in Eliza. And the sealed cradle, if records are to be believed, had once belonged to the fever ward, marked with the initials CR burned into, the base in scorched serif font. When the cradle was finally taken to Baton Rouge for analysis in 1913, it refused to weigh properly. 3 scales gave 3 separate answers: 12 pounds, 3 pounds, 0 pounds. When placed on a stone slab, the cradle produced a sound, low, humming, harmonic, that oscillated at the same frequency as a recording made of Eliza's wedding hymn, but slowed down, reversed, played backwards through time. When that recording was matched to other documents, investigators noted that the reversed hymn was not Eliza's voice, but something harmonizing beneath her, as if she had been singing with something layered into her, something older, deeper, voicing vowels that did not exist in any known language. One linguist from Tulane, who studied the reversed hymn for 7 months, went blind in her left eye. She claimed that the final stanza of the hymn, when slowed by 70%, spoke in coherent English: "Not his grave, not mine, just what we made between." The linguist retired. Her name was never published, and when contacted in 1944 for a retrospective study, she simply replied, "There are no vowels in the cradle," then never spoke of it again. But the deeper mystery remained. Why had Eliza buried him 7 times? Why the precise pattern? Why 7? A theory emerged from those who studied Old Baptist numerology. 7 wasn't just the number of completion, it was the number of sealing, of covenant, of ending what had once been whole. If Edgar, or whatever wore his face, had carried pieces of Eliza within him, then each burial was not an interment, but a sacrifice, of memory, of flesh, of voice, of name, a shedding, not of guilt, but of presence. By the 7th burial, the theory posits, Eliza had finally expelled the last trace of what tethered her to the entity she once called husband, but in doing so, she ceased to exist as a singular person. Her pieces remained scattered, her hair in one grave, her birth record in another, her signature carved into the headboard of the cradle itself. She had become plural, fractured, a woman who could never die because there was no whole self left to bury, only shards, echoes, letters on paper that no longer belong to any living hand. And perhaps that's why the cradle still rocks, because it's not empty. It's never been empty. It holds her pieces, and it's still waiting for the last one, the part that remembers why. By the spring of 1921, the matter of Eliza Renshaw had become an obsession for archivist Mabel Crowthorne, whose work cataloging the abandoned estate records of southern parishes had led her to the Willow region in hopes of compiling a complete death registry for the years surrounding the Civil War. But Willow Parish defied every rule of archival consistency. Most towns followed a predictable pattern. Names appeared, children were born, records expanded, and names faded again with burial dates and surviving kin. But in Willow Parish, the same names reappeared in strange intervals, attached to death certificates written decades apart, often with handwriting so similar that analysts later concluded they had been forged by the same hand, except the signatures didn't match any known resident. Eliza's name, in particular, appeared not just on death notices, but on birth records for children never found, marriage logs for grooms who never lived, and mortgage applications for land never sold. These were not errors, they were insertions, patterns, carefully arranged repetitions, all circling the same anchor date, July 3rd, 1852, the day of Edgar Renshaw's final burial. Mabel found that date scrawled on the back of portraits, inside hymnals, scratched into the undersides of desks in the local schoolhouse, often accompanied by a strange symbol, a figure 8 turned on its side, broken through the middle by a single vertical line, not quite infinity, not quite division, but something hovering between. It appeared again and again, on the back of a rusted weather vane atop the old church, on the spine of a cracked Bible recovered from a barn fire, and worst of all, on the inside lid of the cradle itself, burned with precision and surrounded by 7 smaller marks that resembled teeth. Not carved, impressed, as though something had bitten down in a perfect ring. The teeth impressions were not human, not quite animal either, but the molar placement was too symmetrical to be accidental. It was as if something had sealed the cradle with its mouth. Mabel's notes on the matter became increasingly erratic, eventually shifting from analytical language to fragmented scriptural quotations and strange questions like, is name the opposite of silence? And what if she was never alone in her own head? In June of that same year, she vanished, not from Willow Parish, but from every census, file, or photograph in which she had ever appeared. Her notes survived, barely, tucked into the hollow wall of the Willow Parish postmaster's house, and discovered decades later when repairs were made. But her personnel file was blank, her photograph missing, and her signature on the guest register at the inn where she'd stayed had faded until only the date remained. July 3rd, 1921, exactly 69 years after Edgar's final burial, and just 2 days before a man calling himself Edgar Renshaw reappeared at the courthouse. He wore a black coat far too warm for the season. His shoes were outdated by 50 years. His eyes were the wrong color, too pale, too unfocused, and he asked for a copy of his marriage license. The clerk, unfamiliar with the Renshaw tale, directed him to the archives, but when she returned from her break 15 minutes later, both the man and the book he'd requested were gone. In their place sat a single page, Eliza's will, copied again by hand, but this time the ink was fresh. The signature trembled at the end, as if written by someone who had not held a pen in a very long time. The handwriting matched neither Eliza's nor Mabel's, and for the first time the name at the top had been altered. It now read Clara Ruthven, also known as Eliza Renshaw. What followed wasn't a list of bequests, but a warning. I did not bury him to end him. I buried him so I wouldn't have to remember what we shared. But memory digs deeper than graves. Below that, 7 names, all women, all bearing either the initials ER or CR. All vanished between 1847 and 1860. None ever found. All had once lived within 50 miles of Willow Parish. All had been noted in local papers for unusual traits, singing at odd hours, speaking backwards in sleep, or sewing with thread no one else could see. Each one was listed with a final phrase: wore my hands, wore my voice, wore my teeth, as if they had been taken or shared. The realization horrified the few scholars who studied it in private. Eliza, or whatever she had become, was not a singular woman, but a vessel, a host, a revolving form worn by a consciousness that threaded itself through generations, wearing women like coats and discarding them when the seams began to tear. And Edgar? He may have been the same, a co-inhabitant, a reflection, not a husband, but a mirror, a shape her mind recognized as familiar even when the soul. Inside it had never been human. This reframed the entire Renshaw narrative. What if Edgar's exhumations weren't meant to test reality, but to trap it? What if each burial was an attempt to anchor that echo of him, to keep it from escaping? 7 graves to bind 7 parts, 7 sites to hold 7 lies. But it hadn't worked, because the graves changed. Every time someone returned, the items inside had shifted. One year, it was a lock of Eliza's hair. The next, it was a tooth marked with the cradle symbol. Then a dress tag embroidered with the wrong year. The coffin never held Edgar. It held a reminder, a placeholder, something made in his image but filled with her story. And each time it was buried, the story rewrote itself. On July 3rd, 1922, a year after the man calling himself Edgar Renshaw returned, a local child named Clara Edgewater vanished near the Renshaw house. She had been singing a hymn no one recognized. Her mother claimed Clara had been carving something into the bark of an old tree behind the house. Authorities found the tree days later, bearing a name carved in shaky cursive: Eliza Renshaw. Beneath it, in the child's careful script, she didn't bury him, he buried her 7 times, and he's still digging. The cradle was found tipped over the next morning, and beneath it, for the first time, lay something new. A shoe, small, worn, stained with red clay and marked inside with initials burned into the leather: CR. In the decades that followed Clara Edgewater's disappearance, the town of Willow Parish tried, with growing desperation, to bury more than just bodies. They buried stories, burned letters, sealed rooms, and erased names from schoolhouse walls in the hope that silence might act as salvation. But the red clay didn't forget. The ground beneath the parish never let go. Children who wandered too close to the Renshaw homestead returned with songs they swore they hadn't learned. Melodies in no known key, with words that hummed behind their teeth long after the tune was gone. Old women remembered dreams of sewing the same burial dress over and over, thread pulled from their own hair, stitches drawn tight until their fingers bled. And every July 3rd, without fail, the bells of the long-abandoned Willow Parish Chapel rang out once, never more, never less, just as the sun dipped behind the west ridge. There was no rope in the tower. The bell had been removed in 1910, but the sound came anyway, hollow and distant, like the echo of something that had never truly stopped ringing. In 1948, a small team of folklorists from Baton Rouge arrived to conduct interviews with aging residents for a state-funded oral history project. They expected stories of the war, crop failures, migration. What they got was Eliza. By then, the older generation had stopped pretending the story wasn't real. They spoke in whispers of the widow who wouldn't let him rest, of cradles buried in different foundations, of marriage certificates signed with ash instead of ink. One man, Jacob Lemoyne, claimed his grandfather had dug up the Renshaw plot in 1879 and found 7 coffins stacked vertically in the same grave shaft, each slightly smaller than the last. The smallest one, no longer than a doll's box, had a mirror inside it. The mirror was not cracked, but when Jacob's grandfather looked into it, he didn't see his own reflection. He saw his wife, who had died the year before, mouthing words he could not hear but somehow understood. "She's inside the name," Jacob repeated, staring off past the interviewers. "She never left it. She is it." When asked who she was, Jacob simply smiled. Not Eliza. Eliza was only the shell. The name wore her same as it wore the others, like a mask stretched over a face you can't look at directly. The folklorists published none of this. Their tapes were labeled inconclusive and stored in a university basement where they remained until the summer of 2003, when one of the original reels was digitized for archival transfer. The technician assigned to the task was named Ruth Eliza Crane, a graduate student in folklore whose grandmother had once lived in a place called Willow she had never visited. Her grandmother refused to speak of it, except to say that women with that name don't last long in towns like this. When Ruth listened to the tape, she heard only static at first. Then faintly, beneath the hiss, she heard her own voice, not a recording, her present voice, whispering, repeating the same phrase over and over. "Let me out. Let me out. Let me out." She stopped the transfer, quit the program, burned the reel, but the digital copy remained, and on it, in a file no one created, was a single audio clip, 7 seconds long, the sound of a cradle rocking, followed by a breath. Not an exhale, an inhalation, as if something on the other end of the line had just awakened. Ruth vanished 6 months later, her dorm room left undisturbed except for one detail. Every page of her thesis manuscript had been replaced with a single line typed over and over. Each time, his grave was full of her name. Authorities found no evidence of tampering. No one remembered seeing her leave. But the elevator camera caught one final image. Ruth, carrying a small wooden box wrapped in linen, stepping into the basement archive at 3:07 a.m. The footage ends abruptly. When reviewed, the file title had been changed. It now read, Cradle Entry 7. In 2004, a fire broke out at Willow Parish's remaining courthouse. The flames burned hot and fast, despite no known source of ignition. The only thing spared was the marriage registry cabinet, blackened on the outside, but untouched within. Inside sat one book, one page, one name, Eliza Renshaw, the date next to it, July 3rd, 1852, and beneath that, scrawled in newer handwriting that no one could identify, 3 words, not yet buried. In 1971, the land where the original Renshaw property once stood was purchased by a regional developer who sought to turn the long-abandoned parcel into a series of low-income duplexes for a nearby textile mill. Survey crews arrived in early spring, hacking through decades of overgrowth and collapsing structures, the old stone chimney of the Renshaw home the only part still upright. By April, they had cleared enough to begin the foundation. Trenches. But within the first week, 2 workers quit. One refused to explain. The other claimed to have unearthed a child's cradle made entirely of red cedar, still intact despite the soil. And when he looked inside, the lining was covered in what looked like dark blonde hair. He had a daughter with the same color hair, he said. Had, not has. She drowned 2 years earlier. He packed up and left that day, saying he wouldn't swing a pickaxe into any ground that answered back. The cradle vanished from the site before it could be photographed or examined. The project halted, not for any official reason. No one filed reports, no one raised objections, but slowly, one by one, every contract laborer walked off. The developer, angry but determined, hired a new team and ordered the foundation trenches dug without delay. On the third day, at precisely 4:19 p.m., the backhoe hit something solid. Metal, not stone, and when they pulled it up, it was a small wrought iron plaque, not corroded, not aged. The inscription, "She took the name 7 times." No one could explain how it had been buried below the frost line, over 6 feet down, wedged between layers of clay that hadn't been disturbed in over a century. The crew foreman quit that evening, said he wasn't religious, but something was wrong with the sound the backhoe made when it hit the plaque. It didn't clang, he said. It shivered, like it hurt the ground to touch it. Construction was suspended indefinitely. That autumn, a group of college students from the University of Louisiana, 3 girls, 2 boys, came to Willow Parish to investigate the now local legend of the Widow of 7 Graves. They filmed much of what they saw, mostly standard fare for amateur paranormal researchers: night vision, EVP sessions, spirit boards. But one tape, recovered years later from the estate of one of the surviving students, contains footage that was never aired. It shows the group inside the ruins of what was once the Willow Chapel, now no more than a stone floor and shattered pews overtaken by moss. At 2:44 a.m., a voice interrupts the static. Not any of the groups. It speaks clearly. 3 words. "Where is Eliza?" The voice is male, old, trembling but sharp. On screen, all 5 students stop moving. None of them react as if they heard it, but the camera shakes slightly, as if held by someone who did. Then the sound of something wooden, like a cradle, rocking, slowly, rhythmically, accompanied by what sounds like breathy, wet laughter. The tape ends there. The student who owned the tape never spoke publicly about what happened that night, but in his journal, discovered after his death in 1999, he wrote, "She's not dead. The name keeps her fed. Every time someone speaks it, she remembers herself again." He never married, never had children. He moved 12 times in the last 10 years of his life, each time when someone on the street accidentally called him Mr. Renshaw, even though his name was Alan Graves. The final letter he wrote, found tucked into his Bible, was addressed to no one. Don't name your daughters Eliza. If you love them, don't even think the name. In 2008, a descendant of the original parish priest, Reverend Elijah Banning, came forward with what he claimed was the last page of his great-grandfather's diary. Pages thought lost when the chapel library was partially destroyed in 1873 by flooding. The parchment, though yellowed and brittle, bore a single passage in faded ink. The name does not belong to her. It wears her. It borrows the living. Each grave was a rehearsal. Each time she climbed closer to the original self. I fear the next woman to carry it will not bury anything at all. She will not lose a husband. She will become the grave herself. Historians dismissed it as folklore, but Banning's own daughter, Eliza May, died that same year in a freak accident. She drowned in a baptismal pool during her own confirmation ceremony. Witnesses said she was smiling before she went under and never came up. Her dress was later found folded on the church steps. Inside the folds, a silver locket containing a lock of hair, not hers, and a birth record that listed her name, but with the wrong birth date, July 3rd, 1852. In 2021, during a routine audit of unclaimed death certificates in southern Louisiana's archival registry, a clerk named Deirdre Massey discovered something unusual. Filed under a now-defunct parish known only in microfilm as Willow District 9 were 7 identical death certificates, each for a man named Thomas Renshaw. Same date of birth, same parentage, same cause of death, cardiac arrest following prolonged nocturnal exposure. The issue was not that the documents existed, but that they were dated across a span of 4 years, from 1849 to 1852. Stranger still, each was signed by a different official registrar, and each bore a unique burial location, none matching the next. Thinking it a clerical glitch or duplicate data entry from a poorly digitized file, Massey cross-referenced local graveyard plots across the state's 19th century burial registries. She expected to find only one grave. Instead, she found 7, all marked TR and all reportedly interred with personal effects that did not match the listed decedent. Hair ribbons, baptismal blankets, marriage certificates, all in the name of Eliza Renshaw. Massey flagged the case for historical review, but the file never left the building. 3 weeks later, she stopped coming to work. Her colleagues said she'd become withdrawn, afraid to say the word Eliza aloud, as if it invoked something. In her apartment, the only note she left behind was scratched onto the inside of her medicine cabinet. Don't call her a widow. She's a witness. By then, a pattern had formed among those who had dug too far into the Renshaw name. A folklorist in Mississippi investigating cradle legends died of what the coroner described as self-suffocation, having reportedly stitched his mouth shut with catgut in a locked bathroom. A genealogy researcher tracing female birth records in the 1850s found a cluster of names all born on the same date, April 14th, but listed as different people across various counties. 5 of them were named Eliza. All 5 died on their 30th birthday. Every obituary described a similar scene. Smiling women, eyes wide open, lying peacefully in bed beside graves they'd never dug. Each time, the grave held not their name, but the name of someone they loved. Thomas, Samuel, Elijah, Henry, Jonathan. And in every case, the inscription at the bottom of the marker read, "Bound by vow, broken by name." What was once whispered folklore in Willow Parish had turned into a pattern too deliberate to ignore. But the final recorded encounter, at least the last one documented by a living witness, happened in 2023. It involved a woman named Clara Goodwin, a graduate student working on a thesis titled Burial Rites and Unstable Memory in Antebellum Folklore. She was drawn to the Renshaw case after finding mention of the cradle and the 7 husbands tale in a 1901 memoir from a retired mortician. She traveled to Willow Parish, or what remained of it, now overgrown woodlands intersected only by a forgotten railway line. There, she discovered the remains of what had once been the Willow Parish Chapel, its foundation barely visible under decades of root and moss. In the floor's center, a peculiar circular discoloration marked where the altar had once stood. Beneath it, she uncovered stonework that didn't match the rest of the structure. A round, sealed hatch, ringed with small inscriptions in Latin, not French or English. She copied them down, but before she could open the hatch, night fell. She set up camp nearby, intending to wait for daylight. But what happened after that has been pieced together only from her audio recorder, which was found still running beside her backpack. On it, Clara is heard humming a lullaby, an old French children's song known as Dors Macabre. The recorder clicks off briefly, then clicks on again at 3:09 a.m. Her voice is trembling, whispering, "Something's wrong. It's not a burial site. It's a memory well." She goes silent for 13 minutes. Then, a man's voice, gasping, frantic, says, "Tell her I didn't know. I never knew her name." A scraping sound follows, like something being dragged. Clara doesn't speak again. Her body was never recovered. But 2 days later, a hiker found her tent still pitched, her flashlight still warm, and in the soil near the foundation, someone had etched a name in the dirt. Eliza, but not just once, 7 times, each one slightly messier than the last, as if written by an increasingly desperate hand. No other trace of her was found. Today, Willow Parish is not on any official map. The U.S. Geological Survey lists it as historical interest only, but satellite images from 2018 show a faint outline in the forest near DeSoto County, what appears to be a perfectly circular clearing 22 feet in diameter with 7 symmetrical stones surrounding it. Historians dismiss it as coincidental land settling, but locals who've passed through the area tell different stories, of cradles rocking with no wind, of names whispered into ears during sleep, and of graves that move slightly every time you look away. They say you can still hear her at night if you stay long enough, not mourning, not crying, but remembering, repeating, rewriting, over and over, the same name, until it isn't hers anymore, until it's yours. This channel doesn't pretend to offer answers, only questions that won't leave. So before you sleep tonight, ask yourself, what name would you find in your grave? And would it still be your own?